to join us. We've got some really good content today and look forward to delivering it to you. If you could get to the next slide. So again, my name's Dave Thomas. I'm the solutions executive for our Nordic Bales ERP division with our Infor practice. And really want to just take a second and give you an overview of who we are. Bales was founded back in the mid-90s by Jaime Bales. We've been part of the Infor community really as an official partner since '97. And our organization over time has been able to deliver all aspects of upgrading and implementing all of the Infor solutions around finance and supply chain and HCM and technology. And we really have deep roots in this in the Lawson world. Most of our employees come from Lawson software or customers of Lawson. And we really understand what it is to be a customer, the experience of being a customer using these products over time, and how we can help you as an existing customer utilize them better and move into the future with new technology and new products. Actually, one other component is Bales actually about 2 years ago became a subsidiary of Nordic Consulting. Nordic is a global Epic, Cerner, Meditech, EHR team with managed services and a lot of offerings that help healthcare customers get better within the industry. We're a big part of that. A lot of their customers had Infor, so it made a lot of sense for us to team up. We've really been able to expand our offerings and grow our business around helping Infor customers move forward with their products and technology. So that's kind of the overview of the Bales team. I think we go to the next slide and I'll turn it over to the team. All right. Thank you.
All right, so before I jump into anything else, I just want to call out just quick disclaimer slide. These are sort of our general disclaimers, general legalese, so I won't jump into any of this in particular, but please do peruse this quickly. So we are here today to talk about APIs. My name's Jared Brock. We're going to get to some more introductions here in a little bit, but I'm the technical practice manager. I'm excited to talk about this stuff today. APIs in the Infor space are a really big deal. It's a really efficient, modern, kind of up-to-date way to do a lot of the things people in the Infor space have been trying to do for a really long time. APIs don't live just in Infor. They live all across all industries. It's a totally open standard, and it's finally really becoming efficient to use it in Infor. So I think that explains why so many people are interested in talking about this. We have a lot of ground to cover. I guess without further ado, let's just jump right into introductions.
Hey, thank you, Jared. Hello, my name is Jaime Rodriguez. I'm the technical project manager here at Bales, located in Dallas, Texas. Favorite hobby is soccer. Nice to meet you.
Hi, my name is Robert Schmidt. I'm a technical practice leader on the technical team. I live out in the Tucson, Arizona area, and I love NFL football.
And again, Jared Brock, I'm the technical practice manager. I am out in snowy Fort Collins, Colorado. Jaime threw a curveball there with the hobbies. I guess I'd have to say skiing because it is the winter time out here right now. I do love skiing out here. All right. Well, everybody, we are happy to be here. We got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. I'm first going to talk about just the concepts that are going to be at play during this presentation. So I think for a lot of folks, there's going to be some old stuff that we know pretty well. There's going to be a lot of new stuff. So we'll talk about tools really quickly. I'll talk about kind of the architecture for how do APIs play into the overall Infor architecture that you're going to see in your multi-tenant environment. And I guess I really should make that big caveat. This is all going to be from the perspective of the multi-tenant environment. Everything we're talking about, you can take and spin and twist and bend a little bit to get to work on on-premise environments. But the focus of this is in multi-tenant. And there are some pieces that we're going to talk about that are very specific to multi-tenant. So that's the focus here. We'll talk about IPAs. A lot of folks know what those are, and we're going to talk about them from the context of triggering API calls from inside of the Infor product suite, particularly the applications I think most of us are going to be familiar with, like GHR and FSM. We'll look at some samples. We'll look at some real world examples, some kind of practical examples. And then we'll do the same for kind of APIs more generally. And we'll talk about those in the context of another third-party application, an outside application, trying to get information to or from Infor. And then we'll see some kind of samples of that, and then some real-world examples as well. And we do have a couple live demos in here. So let's talk about the tools first. We'll talk about three kind of important tools as we go through this presentation. The first one is all of Infor Ion and the Ion API Gateway. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is, but basically Ion is the messaging service that exists between all your different Infor products up in the cloud. And part of that service is the ability to handle API calls to kind of, let's call it the outside world, the public internet outside of your multi-tenant environment. And this is a module that you've got in your multi-tenant environment, but you may not have access to it if you're just poking around in there. And that's because it's controlled by role-based security. So there are some security rules that you need to be able to see this stuff in your multi-tenant environment. Here's some links to some documentation for all these things, actually, and I'll post these in the chat here in just a moment. Then Infor Process Designer. So this is the desktop client for Infor process automation, kind of process flow development. So we'll look at some examples that use this. And if you want to use this also, if you don't already have it, it's a download from Infor, from your multi-tenant environment, actually. And it also is controlled through role-based security. So you might have the tool, you might not have access to log into it or do the work in there. So for these things on the Infor side, make sure you do have the appropriate role-based security for it. Then we're also going to talk about and use a tool called Postman. This is just kind of an industry-wide, very common tool that we see in API development. And basically what it lets us do is mimic being a third party or an outside point of origination for API calls. So using Postman, we'll be able to make calls into a live Infor multi-tenant environment. So when we talk about Postman being used here, we really should think of Postman as like a third-party vendor, right? That's when we put on our vendor hat and we act like we're a third-party vendor, and we're going to do that through Postman. So when we talk about the architecture for what this looks like in your multi-tenant environment, there's a lot of different moving pieces. So folks who have been on our technical Informative Fridays before are probably familiar with an architecture diagram that looks pretty similar to this. But basically in the middle here, we have the InforOS tech stack. And this is sort of the big technological driver of everything that happens in your multi-tenant environment. There's a ton of pieces to it. I'm only calling out a couple here. Some of these names are familiar to you. You probably know Mingle. You probably know the data lake, the data fabric. Those of you on the admin side will certainly be familiar with things like IFS and user management. But less familiar to a lot of people is Ion, and that whole layer of messaging that's happening between all of your Infor systems. And again, like I said before, a part of that is the Ion API Gateway. And the role that that application has, or that module has within this tech stack, is to be the central point of public exposure to the wider internet for the whole multi-tenant environment. And remember, if you're multi-tenant, you're in a shared services, shared architecture environment. So everybody has the same endpoint, and that's for us. That's a security reason, right? Infor has an interest in making sure that no other parts of your multi-tenant environment or any multi-tenant environment are exposed to the internet, because we want to wall all that stuff off, right, with a great big firewall. But we do need, and we understand that there's some efficiency to be had by letting approved and secured outside vendors get access to some of that data, right? And that now all happens through the API gateway. So every client shares an endpoint that looks like this up here. And you can see this tenant underscore environment. This is sort of where every different individual multi-tenant environment gets its own little sub part of this endpoint, but the endpoint, the host, is the same for everybody, right? So requests and API calls and things will hit this endpoint, and then it's the Ion API gateway that'll sort that stuff out and parse what that request is and ask, is this secure? Is this not secure? And then send it on its way, if it is secure, to whatever application that call might be looking for. Maybe it's GHR, maybe it's FSM, maybe it's something else like WFM, XM, or even MSCM, right? And that's kind of the flow of the data. So you'll notice that if I'm a third-party vendor over here, I have no way to get right at FSM. I have no path for that. I have to go through the firewall that's up in the Infor cloud around all multi-tenant into the Ion gateway and then into the application that I want. And we'll dive in a little bit deeper to each of these parts here as we go along. I'm stuck in a doom loop with my animation here. Okay. So into the kitchen with the soup. So here's a bunch of acronyms that are going to come at you real fast, and we will try our best to keep making sense of these as we go along. Like I said before, I think most people know what IPA is, Infor Process Automation. That's the latest evolution of the old school process flow. So legacy Lawson folks will be really familiar with this. And nowadays, it's a really powerful workflow engine inside of Landmark. It's what, handles all of the business process automations that we might build inside of your Landmark applications. Then there's Ion, and this one's a little bit newer for most folks, Intelligent Open Network. This is an Infor product, an Infor specific product. It's basically a middleware engine that is native to all of the Infor products that are up in the multi-tenant cloud, but could also be used to integrate other third parties if you wanted to, right? We're not going to talk about that. That's out of scope, but that's sort of the role of Ion, is to be this middleware engine between all these different applications and keep them kind of natively integrated. Then there's API, Application Programming Interface. This has been around for a really, really long time, but only recently has it started to become really practical to include this in your Infor environment. Even old legacy Lawson customers could have done API integrations, but it was a lot more work and it was a lot less secure. Now it's much easier, it's much more straightforward, and it's much more secure. And there's two common types of APIs. And when we talk about Infor, in general, there's a ton of different APIs because it's its own industry, right? None of this API stuff is specific to Infor. But when we talk about Infor, there are two really common ones. There's SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol. This is an older protocol, but it's still sometimes in use, and it's generally XML based. And then there's REST, Representational State Transfer. This is a lot more common now. It's a lot more modern, more flexible, and it tends to be JSON based, but there's some variability in that, right? And the key difference with REST versus SOAP is that REST it's stateless, meaning when you make these calls, there's no data logged with these calls typically, so they're really, really lightweight. They're really easy to process. They're really efficient. And there's also some better security that's built in natively to REST calls, and that's one of the big reasons why we're going to talk about it today. So let's jump into just understanding what might be a really common REST call. And I want us to look, we'll look at a REST call because it is a little bit more common. Understand that a SOAP call is a little bit different than this. And understand that, as you see my animation, this is really generalized. This is just a breakdown of a really, really basic API call, so we can get some of the concepts down before Robert and Jaime kind of jump into more of the specifics. So this URL that you see at the top here is from Postman. It's from that application Postman that we talked about, and you'll see that a little bit more later. And we're going to talk about how this call is constructed. And if you're on the technical side, if you're looking at this URL, this might look familiar to you from what you've seen in other applications, or even what you've just sort of seen in passing in some Infor applications. This looks like a URL, right? And it is. RESTful API calls go through the HTTP protocol. So when we make these transactions back and forth, they look like URLs. And these URLs have some very important components that we'll talk about here. But the first important component in an API in particular, at least when we're talking about REST APIs, is what we call the method. And what that means is basically, it's usually a verb, and it basically means, am I trying to get information? Am I trying to put information somewhere? Am I trying to post some kind of action or some kind of update? There's a lot of methods, but generally speaking, when we talk about Infor, these are really the three common ones that you'll see a lot here, and those are in the middle: get, put, and post. Then we have the host. And again, remember, this looks like what we looked at in the architecture diagram, where we've got this kind of shared host name, mingle-ion API, and then we've got a tenant identifier. And then we have this base. And so this is the part of the URL that basically points to what is the path to the program or the service that I'm calling. And something important to understand about APIs is that they're service oriented, meaning they have to call a service that does something on the target application. I can't just make an API that calls a database table and pulls a particular field back unless there is a service that does that for me. So anytime I'm making an API call, I'm making it to a particular service, and that service lives in a particular place, just like a web page at a particular location and a file server of a web server. And this is the base where that service lives. And we won't go too deep into taking this apart just yet, but when we talk about the GHR, of course, my dog is going crazy. When we talk about things in the landmark-based applications, which is the focus of what we're going to do here today, you'll notice that part of this base points to a business class. So in this case, I'm looking at the currency business class. But the way FSM, the way GHR are built, you could point this to literally any business class you wanted. Every business class natively has services built in that allow API interactions. So kind of underline that in your mind. That is a hugely powerful part of what we're going to talk about here. Other Infor products, things like WFM, things like XM, there are some API integrations. We won't talk about that, and I can't speak to that directly. But when we talk about GHR and FSM, that's a really important part. And then here's the query, right? I'm doing this generic query is defined on the service that we're calling. And then I'm asking for fields, currency, and description. And then I'm saying, give me 5 records, right? And what that looks like from a workflow perspective is that if I'm a third party, I'm going to make this REST API call with a particular method that's going to go to whatever I'm pointing to in my Infor product suite. And then it's going to return that data back to me as part of a response from that call. So we made sense of kind of what is just an API call at a really high level, a REST API call. But what about security? I mentioned before that security is a really, really important part of why this is now so easy. So what's important about that? There are 2 things we need to understand when we talk about API calls in the Infor multi-tenant space. One is called OAuth. This is an industry standard protocol for authorization. It's actually a pretty wide protocol, but in our case, we're using it to authorize API calls specifically, and it's very commonly used for that. So lots of vendors you talk to will be familiar with using OAuth, and particularly OAuth 2.0. And then authorized apps. And this is something on the Infor side. This is an Infor concept that lives inside of Ion API Gateway. And this is the way that we make an endpoint in our own specific, our own individual multi-tenant environment to say that if you hit this endpoint, you have access to XYZ, right? We don't want to give any vendor access to everything in our multi-tenant environment. We want to restrict that to very specific, relevant areas of data, right? And so we control that through role-based security applied to these authorized apps. So if I had a vendor GHX and I wanted to make an endpoint so that GHX could make an API call into my multi-tenant environment, maybe I would apply role-based security that granted GHX only access to my item master, right? Because they don't need to see my payroll. They don't need to see my employee information. They need to see just my item master. And we can have as many endpoints as we want, and we can apply whatever security to those endpoints that we want. So these are the two really important concepts from a security perspective that we'll dive into, and you'll see in practice a little bit more. Authorized apps, I think, is relatively self-explanatory, and it will certainly make a lot of sense when we see the examples that that Jaime in particular is going to walk through. OAuth is a little bit more convoluted, a little confusing until we can kind of walk through it in a workflow. So here's what OAuth looks like. Basically, what's happening here is in order to make a successful API call into the Infor system to actually see data, I first need to get what's called an OAuth token that basically tells Infor this person, this entity is authorized because they have the right token to see the data that I have. And tokens are transient, meaning they don't last forever. And you can specify how long a token lasts, but typically it's less than 2 hours. So we have to go get a token. And if we are authorized to have that token, we can hold that token for 2 hours. But as soon as that expires, we have to go get another token. And so that just really helps us from a security perspective, because it's not like holding a password that might be valid for who knows how long, right? Until somebody changes that password. This is something we need to go get over and over and over again every time we do this. And that action really helps, that kind of high level workflow really helps this be a lot more secure. So what that looks like is a third party will make a call into the Ion API gateway, into one of those exposed authorized apps, and it will basically say, can I have an authorization token? Here are some credentials that I have to your authorized app. If these credentials are valid, can you give me a temporary authorization token? And that's called a bearer token in OAuth lingo. So if those are accepted, Ion API Gateway generates a bearer token, and it sends it back to that third party in response to the call that they made. And by the way, this call is an API call. What's happening here is an API call. It's just structured specifically to grab an OAuth token rather than some type of data about my item master, right? Once that third party has that bearer token, then it can construct another API call with that bearer token for whatever data it's looking for. So when it asks for that item master data, it also hands over that bearer token and says, let me see your item master data because I have the authorization in the form of this bearer token to see that. So we'll see some examples of this, and it'll get pretty technical, but this is basically what's happening when we are involving OAuth. Now, we will see an example where there is no security involved at all. We just are going right to a vendor that has an API service that's publicly exposed. But that only happens because it's a development API service, right? It's meant to do that. Nothing on the Infor side is exposed like that. Everything must go through Ion API Gateway, must have the OAuth token. So we'll see an example that's really easy and looks just like that simple API call that I showed a couple slides ago. But then we'll see stuff that's a little bit more complicated that is required to go through an OAuth token first. So
Jared, sorry, real quick,
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. Just what would be an example of a third party?
A third party is any vendor, any other vendor. So you've got any number of vendors that you might have integrations with. Any one of those is a third party. You might also think of a third party as another system that you have in your organization, but that isn't part of your Infor product suite, right? If you're going up to the multi-tenant cloud's perspective is that everything else is a third party. Everything that isn't in the multi-tenant cloud is a third party. And we interact with it with the same kind of rules and parameters that we're talking about here with Ion API. And I'll just add real quick, because we do have a bunch of stuff to cover. We've got lots of time for questions at the end, or we'll try to make lots of time for questions at the end. So we'll hold those, but I will help help you, Molly, monitor that chat and just make sure we're catching everything. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Robert to talk through kind of basic API to get weather information.
Thanks, Jared. Appreciate that base of the soup and starting to add those ingredients in our acronym soup here. I look forward to adding a few more as we move through this. We're going to kind of dive into the IPA side of this and where we're going to try and utilize making some of the API calls. Our first kind of real quick, simple example that we wanted to work through is really just in essence that open API where we can grab the current weather. So I'm actually going to grab the screen here real quick. And we're actually going to head over to Infor Process Designer. Can someone confirm you can see that for me?
You got it.
Awesome, thank you. So this isn't necessarily an IPA or IPD class or a session. So hopefully there is some base kind of level knowledge there. And this is the IPD client that we talked about locally installed in your machine. You do need to have Infor access to be able to get into this. So as I said before, really basic, real general kind of flow that we're looking at in order to show a quick example of what we're doing here. In the start node, just as a lot of it for IPAs, we're setting up some variables, some information that we know we're going to get back when we do the API call itself. We're going to hit over into our web run node. This is where we're going to do the API call itself. And then just kind of tying back to what Jared was talking about, down here, I'm going to call out our method. In this case, we're going to be doing a get. We're going to go and get some information from the API portal development area. I'm going to come up here and call out, here's my web root. So this is the equivalent of our host. So this is the host of the URL that we're getting from that open API. And then I come down here to my web program right here. So this is our base and our query that's going to pull that information out. So we're going to be providing some latitude and longitude. We went ahead and put in our Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where our office is. We want to check on what the weather is out there today and then provide that information back. So this goes out, gets the information, pardon me, and brings that data back as a JSON message. If you're comfortable handling that, you could definitely do it. Infor does provide a JSON parser in order for it to actually parse that data out for us. So when that information comes back, I can start doing things with the data that comes back. In our case, we talked about it being simplified. We're getting just a couple fields, but this could in essence be dozens and dozens of data that we're going to get back. And I'll talk about a more real world example where we dealt with that here in a second. So I'm going to take the results from our web run here and I'm going to give it to my parser. And then on my output, this is where I'm going to start some of my mappings. So I'm going to take the wind direction, the temperature, and the time, and I'm going to assign those to my variables. We went ahead and called this out in two ways. Technically, it can be done in one or the other or both, like we're doing here. But I assigned these three variables here. And then as everyone knows, our tried and true assign node, we're actually going to assign time and wind speed here. We're going to take the data from the parser and we're going to use the JavaScript expression and we're going to take the wind speed value and tie that into the wind speed variable. So that allows us the ability, and this is where we could tie in, additional JavaScript if we needed to do some if then else stuff, if we needed some case, if we needed some of that stuff, we could do that here in order to assign, map, and do different things based off of the data that's coming in, right? So I ran this, you'll see from our log here, this was ran shortly after our call started, just showing in the console log that we did, here it is, we're pulling, we're assigning some of our variables out, and then here's our web run. So this is actually going out and doing the call itself out to the API, and then we're getting data elements back. So our success string was found. So this is saying, yes, you went out, we got data, bring the information back and provide it. And then here's where we're going to start parsing it. So here's my time, and underneath my assign node, here's my wind speed, and then here's my temperature. It is in Celsius, so it's -7.5 out there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. And then we're coming back through and coming through to our end. So obviously very simplistic, but gives you the idea of utilizing that method, host, base, and query to get some sort of information, and then providing that back within the IPA itself. And then, as you can imagine, we can do lots of other stuff. But that takes us back to looking at some real world examples that we've implemented on some other clients. So, Jared, do you want to take that back?
I think I got it. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, see the live demo.
Right.
Excellent. So we're going to look at the first real world example here. We worked with a client and they had a third-party talent acquisition system. So the question earlier, Molly, what are third parties? In this case, it was talent acquisition, right? They're posting jobs to job boards. They're utilizing and acquiring candidates, and then working with those candidates back. So we used Infor in order to create the job requisitions themselves, because we wanted to utilize the positions and the data elements that were already in Infor and provide those over to the third-party talent acquisition. So, and we triggered a secondary node. So this comes from an additional IPA, and that's why it says from parent, because it's coming from one that was a secondary process on those job requisitions. And then you'll see the get node or get token and parse token. That was Jared talking about. We needed to go get that bearer token and bring it back and utilize that to get information. So we're looking at, we needed to get recruiter and hiring manager information from the talent acquisition side. So we're going out doing different API calls to get that information, and we needed to parse that in order to provide more Infor related information to it to fulfill the full job requisition requirement from the third-party vendor. Once we had all of that information together, we put that in a single message, and then our post job then actually posts that job that we created and fulfilled into that talent acquisition system. So we're utilizing multiple API calls here, in essence, to be able to put together the full string and then send it over and post a job within that talent acquisition system. And that way, from there, they can post it the job board. They can, get different candidates, go through that process before we need to bring them back into Infor. And moving us to our next example. So once we had a candidate, right, they've gone through the process in talent acquisition, they know that this is the person that we want to hire within the system. We then need to get them back in Infor. So we didn't want to do that manually. We wanted to write an IPA or an automated process to get them back across. So again, we needed to go and get a token. We need to have that authentication back in there. And then the hires there on the left, this is actually us getting a list of hires based off of a status in that talent acquisition system of people that we know that we need to either hire or rehire within Infor. And then there was a lot of other things in between that doesn't necessarily need to come through this conversation, but we wanted to make sure at the end we show this is where we're actually calling a hire resource action request, and we're utilizing Infor system functionality in order to hire them within the system, go through that approval process that client has, and then depending on if they already existed, we needed to obviously do a rehire. So in the same process of that automation, we're able to do API calls to get information, and then we can update Infor with either hire, rehire, or transfer, or any of those functions that we would normally do from an HR perspective. Okay. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you, Robert. So those are some great examples, and I want to just underline again. There's two things that I think are really important about what we just saw. That in that first example that Robert had, how easy it was to get that information from that vendor, that third-party weather app, right? It ran that very simple, very quick API. It gave us real-time, immediate data in the form of just a couple of values that we asked for, and we could run that over and over and over and over again, right? It's 1 second each time, less than that probably, right? So very, very quick, very efficient. And then the other thing that I probably should have called out a little bit earlier to frame this better that Robert hit really well is that you'll notice here APIs are being used transactionally in a lot of cases, right? We're not talking about moving giant chunks of data. We're talking about give me a list, like give me a list of some positions that you have, give me a list of some open jobs, give me a list of some hires that are in your system, and then let me take those if they match some particular criteria I have and do something with them in the Infor system, right? So APIs become really efficient and become really helpful when we're talking about those kind of focused pieces of data that we're looking for, not if we're trying to copy out the payroll history data table, right? So let's kind of flip things around a little bit and jump into APIs. So here we're going to talk about, Robert showed us what it looks like when we're inside the Infor system to go try to contact an outside application, a third-party vendor, whatever it is, via API to pull back some important information. Jaime is going to show us what does it look like for a third party, for that API call to originate from a third-party system and go into the Infor system to pull some of that data from Infor, right? And we talked about before, that weather example was really easy because there's no security at play there, right? But this Infor one is going to get a lot more complicated because there's a lot of security that's at play from the Infor perspective to protect your multi-tenant environment, right? So Jaime's going to jump into all that now.
Hey, thank you, Jared. I'm going to go ahead and add more alphabets to this alphabet soup. And so in this real world example that we put together, the third party service in this use case, we hired them to provide, G10 and unspec code data enrichment services on our item master. So let's go ahead and just refer this one as our third party service. As we walk through this flow, I'm going to slowly walk through this flow so that way we understand exactly why we hired this person and how they're going to architect their solution. So the third-party service is going to leverage our Infor API. And going back to the architecture diagram, we've already gave them the URL, we gave them the base, we gave them the parameters on which they need, and the OAuth security and the role in order to do this type of Infor API, as well as the authentication, and then moving over to request the item, the supply chain item. They will request that item information. They will receive a JSON payload back as their response. And of course, they will take that response and it will go through that third-party service black box for data enrichment and cleansing. After they receive that, the third party says, okay, I'm ready to update your ERP Infor CloudSuite supply chain for your item master. And so they call back the Infor API, again, using the OAuth, using the URL, the base and the parameters. And then they're going to update the item. And then after they do the update, they're going to get a response back saying that they were successful. And so in this use case, this is a very typical use case that I've seen, with a couple of vendors out there in the healthcare space to update G10s and unspec codes. Next. All right, first, let's go ahead and go into API testing. As a business analyst, you would say, okay, now I need to figure out, how can I set this up so that way I can communicate some specifications to that vendor. So you would first find the Infor Ion API. If you can't find the application in your application selector, then it goes back to roles. You may not have the right roles, so go ahead and ask for those roles in Infor API. Once you go into Infor API, you should be able to look for an FSM endpoint, and that's finance supply chain management. Next. Number 3, we're going to go ahead and drill into the FSM/FSM SOAP documentation. We call this, an entry point into their Swagger. So we click on the yellow highlighted document to drill into the API documentation, so that way we can further go into those business classes that Jared spoke about earlier. So when you do go into the FSM SOAP, you're going to see thousands of business class, and they're arranged in alphabetical order. So you could see where I actually typed up item in the filter to kind of help me, consolidate to what I'm trying to search for. Once I find the item business class, I want to know more about that service. So I'm going to go ahead and drill down into the documentation once more. Once I further drill down into that documentation, number 5 depicts, what those methods are that are available for the item. So you will see, some generic services like a get. You'll see a method for a post. You'll see another get. You'll see a delete. You'll see a put. You see gets, and then you see post. So there's a lot of methods that you need to explore, and then once you find the right one, you can communicate that or test that locally. So I'm gonna go into how to test that locally. Next. And so testing that locally. So when you find the service that you want, in this situation, I chose the generic get method. And what that is like, I'm trying to get information. I want, I either want to get all of the items, all 2,000, 40,000 items, or I just want to filter down to a specific item and I know exactly what item I want. So you can, toggle through some of the filters that or the parameters that they give you. But in order to do that, I highlighted try it now. And so through try it now, you're able to, internally test some functionality. In this situation, I did all. It's easier. And it, based on my third-party vendor, they requested all items. And you can go into more of a filter of active items if you had to. Next. So after we tested our API service locally and we got the output that we needed, and we know that, the URL, the base, the parameters, we have everything that we need in order to communicate technically how the vendor will fetch items or update items. But we're missing a component. We also need to provide security for that vendor to come into our ERP. And I'm going to go into this. So the first thing you want to do is go ahead and create a backend service. So you would go to Ion API and create a backend service. After creating the backend service, it's going to create the OAuth key for you. But before it creates the OAuth key, it's going to ask you, do you want to provide or create a service account? And so with the service account, the best practice is to go ahead and create a user in your role-based security for Ion. If you decided to use Jaime Rodriguez as a user, and then if Jaime Rodriguez goes away, goes to another company, starts, as a CTO for Google, then as soon as someone terminates that account, the API service will stop working. So you kind of want to create a Lawson or an Ion user for that purpose. And then you also need to assign the specific roles for that user. So if you want that user to stay within the item master domain as a specialist, or you can go view only, you can define your own security classes if you wanted to, but you need to assign some type of security, as well as Ion API user. Ion API user says this service account user is able to use Ion API. Next. And so if once you connect the service account user, it's going to make you download the OAuth credentials. And there's a lot here, right? I know Jared mentioned that, those credentials are pretty stringy. So what we want to do is download those credentials, look at those credentials, and then map them to our postman. So the first one will be the client ID. The second one, the CS, would be the client secret. And I've kind of used arrows to help us visualize where they go. And so with the PU and the OA, you concatenate those together and you have the access token. And then with your service account username and password, which has been encrypted, you also want to put that into OAuth as well. And the first thing you need to do is, okay, now that I have all of these credentials and it's OAuth 2.0, I'm going to click on Get New Token. And so that's going to be the bearer token that Jared was speaking of earlier. Once you have that bearer token, then you're going to say, use the token. And once you use the token, then you're ready to do an update or get. But in this situation, we already received the items. Now we're ready to update. Our third-party service received the items, and now they want to update with the proper unspec codes. This is exactly why we're paying them to do this. And so I'm going to go ahead and quickly open up and take control of the screen so that way I can demonstrate. One second. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So as you can see, I've opened up the item, a bandage Kofex, item 01010001, and there's no unspec code. So I'm going to go into my postman, and I'm going to go into my authentication, and the same thing, right? So it's already pre-filled, pre-populated with the information from my JSON credentials. I'm going to hit Get New Token. It's going to give me that free pass for 2 hours that Jared was speaking of. I'm going to use that token as my password. And then based on my body, I have information filled in like my item, some mandatory items, information, item group, description. Is it active? Yes, I want to go ahead and make it active. And then here's my unspec codes. And then when the third-party service provides that update, they're going to receive this JSON response. And also they're going to look at the status of 200 OK, which gives them the thumbs up that the server did acknowledge and accepted the response.
And real quick, I'll just add, everybody pay attention to the very bottom of this response here where we get this message and then item updated, right? That'll be really important for your vendors and as you go through testing to get familiar with what comes back in the response, right? Because Jaime's right to point out that status of 200, like with all HTTP, that means a successful connection, right? But that doesn't always mean that the system did what we wanted it to do, right? So we'll just want to pay attention to what is that message that comes back.
Yes, thank you. And also, once they made the update, let's say the very next day, they're going to go out and they're going to go find a list of all items. Do the same for the item request. And notice, I want to go ahead and make notice that this is just a list, a generic list. I want all fields. I want to limit it by 5. And I want my output to be JSON. Oh, well, what happened? So I didn't get my access token. So I need to go ahead and proceed, use my token. This is a very good situation where if you come across this error, it's probably token related. And there we go. So it's giving me a lot of information here, but what I really want to focus into is, it's giving me all of the fields that the third-party service needs in order to capture, so that way they know exactly what to cleanse or what to data enrich. And then after they get that information, they go in here and they make their updates, they're done. And so if we go back to the ERP, you will see that I'm going to refresh this record, and then there's my unspec code, and I am complete. Over to you, Jared.
All righty. Thanks, Jaime. Okay, so we're going to stop there. We got a little bit of time for questions. We covered a huge amount of ground just now. We necessarily had to skip over some of the finer details in some of these things. We didn't get too far into the weeds, but let's take a couple minutes now. We can open this up for questions, and let's just see. Let's see what we get out there. Molly, do you have any questions teed up from the chat you want to touch on? Or you
Sure.
want me to just go through them? Okay.
Sure. So following up from the earlier question of example of a third party, a follow-up question to that was, is S3 considered a third party?
So I think not the easy answer. There is no easy answer. The short answer is it kind of depends. If you're single tenant hybrid with a multi-tenant environment, you do have some Ion integration already with your S3 environment. And that's part of the Infor provisioned kind of hybrid environment. So in most cases, you may not need to go an API route to integrate your hybrid S3 with your multi-tenant. If you've got kind of a non-traditional hybrid, you're not part of a single tenant S3, maybe you have like an on-premise S3 with Infor Provision Cloud, it gets a little bit dicier there, and that would be very case specific, if that makes sense. Robert, Jaime, anything to add to that?
I guess we may need to look at a use case because you have direct access to S3 more than likely at that point via, let's say, like IPA, unless you wanted to intentionally push something through the Ion API gateway. But you have other functionality, I think, there that you don't necessarily have to use API, unless I'm not thinking of that correctly there, Jared.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. IPA in that case probably is your best bet, right? Because you don't have to deal with one of the big things that APIs help us with, which is the security aspect, because the assumption would be you already have some good secure connection between those environments. But if for some reason you didn't, I think API does become a good option, and then you would sort of treat that disconnected S3 environment as a third party, if that makes sense.
Okay. And then while you were giving, I think during Jaime's example, the question came in, is that user in mingle only or landmark? Does it need actor context or agent assigned?
So that's actually a really good question. I hadn't thought about that in the context of this presentation before, but it's not a mingle user only. It needs to be a landmark user, and it needs to have the appropriate landmark access to whatever you're looking at. So if you are, unless I'm mistaken, Robert or Jaime, if you're looking at something that's behind, let's call it the wall of actor context, that user would need the appropriate wholesome security to whatever it is that you're trying to get to.
Correct. So you would set up you would define a service account, especially if you're AD authenticated. It would be a password doesn't expire type situation that then gets set up in IFS, which pushes to landmark. You would want to assign the actor context, but it does not need the agent or an employee record in order to do its functionality. And since it is role based, you would want to assign the appropriate roles. Depending, you may even create or configure a subset of roles. That way it's gaining access to specifically what it needs, but it's not a necessity to do that if you're comfortable giving it the roles that are built out or defined out in the system.
Yep. Good point. Good point.
Okay, and then just had a few questions about recordings and copy of the PowerPoint, which we will get out to all of you. And then a couple of questions about if they could get details on the examples that you showed, and can they have a sample of the file for reference of your test samples?
Jared, I don't think there's any issue with putting the sample IPD file out for the weather.
No, I don't think so at all.
Molly. yeah, Molly, we can work through you to get you
Okay.
example. I mean, obviously they would need IPD to look at it, right? And we could potentially do some potential PDF stuff as well if we need to. But yeah, we can work with you to provide that.
Great. And then Paul wanted to let you know that he got his weather API example working from your
That's awesome.
presentation.
That's awesome. I love it.
That's what we like to hear.
Yes, we do.
I know we had some pre-submitted questions, and I think what we'll do is just answer those directly, since we do have those people's emails, just for the sake of time. But for now, that's all that's in the chat. So I think we're back to Dave for the rest of the presentation.
All right, thanks, Molly. So thanks for attending today's session. We have some really exciting topics coming up for the rest of the month. Next week, we have demystifying Infor delivered process flows, which you can go register to attend that out at by sending Molly an email at the email address below. It's kind of the same way you registered for this one. The 17th, inventory transactions impacting the GL. That's a really good one. I think we'll be have some exciting topics on that as well. And then the next one is what to expect when you're moving from S3 to the cloud for HR talent. All right. I think we have one more slide. There we go. So yeah, again, thanks for coming to the Informative Fridays. And we'll have another session in May. And all of the ones we've done over the last couple of years are recorded and out on our YouTube channel. So please go to our website if you're interested in looking back at topics we've delivered in the past. I guess we have one more thing. We have the offering. It's free. It's 30 minutes with one of our consultants to talk about anything related to or get help with something you need help with within your Infor Lawson system. So it's a great opportunity to meet a real consultant, talk through a real problem, and get a real solution. So if you're interested in that, please reach out and visit us at balesllc.com, and you can sign up for that. Or you could reach out to your Bales account executive. So for me, anybody in the West Coast, I'm your account executive. So if there's an interest here, please let us know. Thanks again, and hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Great presentation, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye, guys.